So I've been really busy this morning. I've gotten some good work done. Got the Hanukkah mini skeins all wound up and ready to go out. So that's really exciting. I'm excited for those to get into their homes. Got yarn soaking and all that kind of stuff too. But I don't know, I'm just kind of feeling weirdly off, a little anxious. So I'm gonna do some yoga, noticing a theme, I'm sure. Shower, clean up the house, and then get back to work. Yeah, it's Sunday, but it's what happens when you take a day off, or several in the beginning of the week too. Still playing catch up. But yeah, so that's what's going on with me. And then later I'm gonna be talking, like at the end of the episode, I'm gonna talk about my process with the November Sock Club, right? How I came up with the colorway, how I come up with the design and write up the pattern and all that good stuff. So if you are not interested in that or don't want any spoilers, this may be a shorter vlog for you guys. But yeah, so oh, that was what I wanted to talk about. So one of the nice things is my yoga teacher, her studio, they are doing sort of an online membership thing as well, like to accompany the in-person classes. So I'm gonna try out, it's new, so I'm gonna try out one of the online classes and see how it goes. Of course, Ezra believes that if I'm in here and I'm on the ground, same thing with Lucy, it must be time to hang out with my animal friends, but not so much. Hey guys, so I'm sorry I've been a little hit or miss with the vlogging the last couple days. This weekend got swamped with the yoga retreat and all that kind of stuff, the workshop. And then yesterday was really spent catching up with Jordan and catching up on some work that didn't get done because I was at the workshop for 2 days. I know I've been promising you guys a video on my design process for the sock club, so I figured I would just sit down and do that and combine this with whatever footage I have from yesterday, which was Sunday, because I did a little bit of dyeing, I did a lot of dyeing yesterday, but I got a little bit recorded, like some footage from that, so hopefully that'll be a nice counterbalance to the episode before that. But anyway, this whole vlogging thing is more difficult than you'd think. I usually start the process for a given month's sock club a full month before it's released, right? So October 1st, I'll start thinking about what I'm doing for the November sock club, right? Usually by that time, I've just released the pattern from the previous month, so I finally have time to start thinking about it, right? So I'll start by kind of doing some free association and just kind of start thinking about words and colors and emotions and things like that that are called to mind when I start thinking about a given month, right? So for January, for example, that was my Aube or Dawn colorway, and the pattern was First Light. Because, you know, for me, I was thinking January, I was thinking new, I was thinking beginnings, I was thinking cool and cold, bare branches and trees, that kind of thing, right? So that's kind of how I came up with like a dawn colorway. I wanted some black or dark gray speckles to kind of get bare tree limbs in there. The twisted stitches and cables, those were, you know, again, kind of thinking about you know, tree limbs crisscrossing and things like that. So that's kind of how I'll begin, right? I may or may not do some searches on Pinterest. Some months yes, some months no. Sometimes I'll look through pictures but not actually make a mood board, all that kind of stuff. And I try and change it up so that each month is different from the previous, both in terms of the colorway, but also in terms of the pattern, right? So I try not to do 2 lacy patterns in a row. That's not always the case. Sometimes there'll be eyelets in adjacent months, sometimes not. You know, there won't be 2 that are twisted stitches, you know, right next to each other, just kind of changing it up. Although, of course, I'm sure as soon as I've said that, I will go ahead and break that rule. But yeah, sometimes I want to do a bunch of small motifs stitched together. Sometimes I'll do one big motif, right? Like the June, the vaguely summery socks, that was kind of a big motif that went around the entire ankle, and then the foot was plain. So that's kind of how that part of it goes. And kind of as I'm coming up with just kind of my inspiration for the month, I'll start getting a feel for, like I said, like the colors, but then also the different dye techniques, right? So am I gonna do a really variegated colorway, kind of like February was? I do love playing with speckles. Some months I'll do speckles over variegation. Sometimes it'll be speckles on its own, right? Or speckles on top of a solid base. May was like that, right? With the Sunset on the Sun, right? Which had a really nice pale peach base with speckles on top. I've done one micro striping colorway. That was March. That was my birthday colorway. So I kind of went with my own favorite colors there. And I did a full-on self-striping. I think it was like 4 or 6 rows for April. But yeah, so that's kind of how I start thinking about things, kind of start getting a feel for the mood of the month and how can I change it up and not have, you know, back-to-back months that look really similar. September's colorway kind of started with that. I wanted something warm because it's, you know, kind of the beginning of fall, but it's still fairly warm out, at least here. You know, when I'm drawing color inspiration too, I'll think back to either when I was living in France or trips to France, or, you know, my life here in Indiana. And I don't know, I kind of kept coming back to the really warm light of the beginning of fall, both when I was living in the south of France and here, right? So I kind of get to drawn into the inspiration as well. So I just kind of started layering colors, and that's how I got the orange that I really love. That is now its own tonal itself, which is rouille or rust. So for November, right, the current one that I'm working on, that signups have just come out for, I thought a lot about the drying cornfields that are around me. You know, Thanksgiving obviously is very salient for me for November. Really chillier, cooler weather. For some reason, like candlelight, firelight, that sort of thing really is very, again, salient for me when I'm thinking of November. You know, pops of darker, warm colors, right? That for me is very much the beginning of winter, right? Cool, dark colors, for me, that's more January, February, you know, later winter. Obviously everyone's experience is different. Everybody's inspiration, right, or associations are going to be different. But that was where I was working from. Again, I'm just kind of playing around, trying to layer colors, get a good base that I like, and then add color on top, right? And so I wanted something, again, that's going to be a nice, warm, cozy sock. That's really what I'm looking for at the moment, right, for this month's sock. As I mentioned, I think a couple days ago on the vlog, I want a pattern that is going to be a larger motif instead of a bunch of small motifs built together, which is what I did in September and in May, for example, right? Those were small motifs built together. October's was not. October's was actually sort of several large motifs that were built together. But for November, I wanted just to kind of keep it to one thing, kind of more like January and June. So here it is caked up, right? So you can see I've got a really nice warm base, and then I layered some color over it, kind of playing around with different speckling techniques. Now, most of the time when I'm speckling, I like doing really nice, fine micro speckles. Micro speckles, then, I mean, with some patches of larger speckles, that's kind of just naturally what happens. For this, I wanted it to spread a little bit more, so I played around with how I was applying the dye and all sorts of other things that I won't get into. There have to be some trade secrets. Honestly, I think so far this may be my favorite colorway. Well, at least my favorite colorway of the moment, which is good, right? I want my monthly things to be my favorite colorway of the moment, right? So it's very warm. You kind of get that glow sort of feeling to it. So there's some orange in there, there's some caramel, there's actually some pops of green, deep green in there, some purple, just really nice, really cozy, really warm. And so then I'll kind of start in on the knitting. Typically, well, always actually, I will start with the colorway, right? I'll have an idea of what I want to do for the pattern, which may inform the way I apply the dye, the kind of colorway I dye up, things like that. So yeah, I mean, they work hand in hand. Some months I'll start with the pattern, or at least with an idea for the pattern. Some months I'll start with an idea for the colorway. But usually they're really kind of forming hand in hand. And so once I get the colorway dyed up, then I'll really start exploring my stitch dictionaries. Because while I'll have a mental idea, you know, I'll have kind of come up with an idea for the pattern, I need to actually come up with something that's realized. Sometimes I do that completely on my own. Most of the time though, I'll at least draw inspiration from a stitch dictionary. You gotta modify them, things like that, but so I'll either use, these are two of my favorites. They are both by Barbara Walker. This is her first and second. Lots of good stuff in here. They are all written to be knit flat, and they are all written directions, not charted. So, you know, I'm definitely going to have to modify them as I go for working in the round. Some months I'll come up with a chart, some months I won't. The difference on whether or not there's a chart kind of depends on how straightforward the charting is. Theoretically, you can chart anything. Some charts are more straightforward than others. Sometimes writing a chart just makes it look more complicated, just complicates things, especially if you've got a changing number of stitches in each row. Or if you've got some more complicated stitches, the chart just isn't quite as obvious. I also got a new one that I'm absolutely in love with. I think I showed this, I know I showed this on the blog, right? The Japanese Knitting Stitch Bible. This is gorgeous. I love these. I'm obsessed. They are complicated. They're super intricate, right? Like that chart is huge and insane, but it's just so beautiful. If I were just designing for myself, I would do complicated stuff like this all the time, and it would take me 3 months to knit a pair of socks. But I'm not just designing for myself. This is a club, and the socks for it should not take a month or 3 months or 6 months to knit, right? So I want to tone things back, step it back a little bit, and modify, right? So I'll go through, I'll find some ideas, and then I'll start kind of applying them to my normal sock recipe, right? For my feet, for example, I know that I really like a 64 stitch count, right? That is my preferred sock. For certain patterns, right, if there's a lot of cables, I know that I need to up that to usually a 72 stitch. Or if I'm working on a much denser gauge, right, and a thinner yarn, or if I'm working on size 0 needles, I know I need to go up to a 72 stitch count. If I'm working on a lacy pattern, or if I'm working on larger needles, right? If I'm, let's say, making socks on a 1.5, US 1.5, or US 2, I may go down to a 56 stitch count, right? So all these things, I mean, that's all gauge issues, right? Number of stitches per inch, but usually 64 stitches on a US 1, that gives me a really good fitting sock. For this month, like I said, I knew I wanted one motif that went all the way around the sock, right? Not a combination of things or anything like that. I wanted something that was going to read fall, that kind of went along with the colorway. I don't know, I was feeling kind of a botanical sort of feel this month, so that's kind of what I went with. And I wasn't initially thinking I wanted anything lacy, but sometimes the pattern just kind of, you know, the stitch motif just kind of calls to you. But you can see this month's is actually pretty lacy. Because of that, you know, I knew that I needed to adjust the needle size and the stitch count, right? So I kind of went in between, right? I went to a US 1.5 needle and I went down to a 60 stitch count. So balancing those two things is giving me a sock that fits me well, right? It's got the gauge I want, it fits my calf well, all that kind of good stuff, right? And I love these little acorns. I don't know, they make me really happy. I'm finding that the colorway and the pattern, they're not competing. With lace, I tend to want a simpler colorway. And this one, while there's a lot going on in the colorway, right? You get the variegation in the base, you get the pops of different colors, all that kind of stuff. There's not a ton of contrast, right? One's not overwhelming the other. I'm absolutely loving it. There are certain parts of my patterns at this point that kind of remain consistent. The cuff, I think at this point all of my cuffs are now 1x1 twisted rib, which can be a little bit of a pain in the ass to knit. Sorry, excuse my language, but it's true. But it just wears so well. You know, it really does give that nice tight cuff that stays up. I'm going to continue putting it as my recommended cuff. Obviously, if you really hate knitting those things, right, feel free to modify. Typically, the counts I'm going to give you, you can do a 2x2 instead, or a 1x1 without twisted stitch, or whatever your preferred cuff is. Honestly, always feel free to change patterns to suit your preferences. It may take a little bit more trial and error, but at least you're gonna end up with a garment that suits what you like. I kind of go back and forth between putting in directions for cut and heels, right, afterthought heels, or heel flap and gusset. Sometimes it depends on the pattern, sometimes it depends on the colorway, sometimes it depends on what I feel like doing, right? If I'm doing a toe up pattern, I'm gonna throw in an afterthought heel as the directions for the heel, because honestly, that's just what I'm more comfortable writing. I don't do a lot of toe up socks normally. I'm predominantly a cuff down sock knitter, but when I do a toe up sock, I use an afterthought heel, right? So explaining the measurements necessary for where to start a heel and all that kind of stuff, I'm not as comfortable with, and I don't want to go and crib that information from somebody else's pattern. Does that make sense? Writing a cuff down sock, you know, I've got that down enough that I can write my own directions for it, right? I don't need to go looking at other people's patterns to figure out how to explain it. Typically in my patterns, I'll put, you know, directions, and then in parentheses, I'll have or preferred X, Y, or Z. If it's not explicitly stated, go ahead and do it. Make sure your pattern, your sock, your whatever is fitting the way you want it to. For certain patterns, you know, maybe do follow the written directions, right? Like if you've got a pattern that extends onto the heel or onto the toe, or there's patterning in the cuff, then yes, go ahead and follow exactly what the designer has intended. You know, if it's just a 1x1 cuff, do your own thing, right? There's no patterning going on here, no nothing. It's just what happened, the designer happens to prefer. I need to get off that little soapbox. But yes, so the first sock that I knit for any of these sock club patterns is basically my swatch. I will play around with things, I'll make modifications, I may frog this thing 3 or 4 times depending on what's going on. Some months are worse than others. And to be honest, some months I will end up with 2 mismatched socks because I'll get all the way through it and then evaluate and realize, I'm gonna change this, this, and this. That happened to me in September. My September socks do not match. That's fine. It's whatever. And I mean, they're going in my shoes. I don't even mind. But I'm really happy with the second sock, and honestly, that's what matters. I will knit the first sock. I'll make notes as I go along. Typically, as I'm knitting the second sock, that's when I write the actual pattern, transforming the basic notes into the row by row instructions. Especially because as you're converting things to being knitted around, things need to change. And I will tell you for this one, there is a lot of, you know, slipping stitches from one needle to the next to keep stitch counts the same and to make sure that the motif is actually even all the way around, right? There's no weird gaps or breaks or anything like that, which makes it slightly more challenging. You know, you've got to pay attention a little bit more, but I think ultimately it's just going to be a really, a really great sock. Can I just also show you the heel flap here? I'm really excited about how this is knitting up. It's just such a pretty colorway. I'm really quite proud of this one, I'm not gonna lie. It's warm, it's cozy, it's basically exactly what I want. It is a brown based colorway, right? But it's got dimension to it. It's got some extra warmth to it. It's interesting. I don't know. I'm really excited. I'm really pleased with it. It's exactly what I wanted. That's basically how I go about it. Honestly, I think the hardest part for me, and this is gonna sound crazy, but the hardest part of the sock clubs is coming up with names for both the yarn and the pattern. Naming things is not my forte, especially because usually I'm not inspired by like a specific word or a specific thing, right? It's more of like a feel or a concept, and pairing that with a name, not easy. But I can tell you this colorway I've named Abondance or Abundance, and then I don't know what I'm gonna call this pattern yet. Clearly they're acorny, but I love it. I'm really, really pleased with these. I'm really excited. I love these socks. I love the yarn. I love the pattern. And it's a fun challenge every month coming up with a colorway and a pattern and getting it out on time. I hope that clarifies how I go about things. I hope you found this remotely interesting or insightful or whatever. Other than that, I think I'm gonna leave this here and I will talk to you guys again tomorrow. I think today's episode, combining yesterday and today, is gonna be long enough. Yeah, see you guys later.